November 3rd, 1984. Pine Ridge, West Virginia, woke slowly that morning, as though reluctant to face another day. The air was thick with fog, the kind that softened every outline and dulled every sound. It hung low in the valley like a shroud, pressing against the skeletal silhouettes of bare oak and sycamore trees. The last of autumn's leaves lay slick against the ground, their edges curling and blackening from the week's steady rain. The scent of wet earth and decaying foliage was everywhere, mingled with the faint tang of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys of a few scattered homes. At the far end of Main Street, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt, lined with shuttered stores and faded signs, the sheriff's station sat quiet, its single light glowing against the gloom. Inside, Deputy Samuel Harlan leaned back in his chair, his boots crossed at the ankles, sorting through the morning's mail. Most envelopes were routine past-due notices, hunting permit renewals, the usual small-town bureaucracy. His fingers hesitated when they reached a plain white envelope, its paper soft and worn as though handled many times. There was no return address. He turned it over. The handwriting on the front was shaky, uneven, the kind of cursive that seemed to tremble across the page. The Fayette County postmark caught his eye just 40 miles east, close enough to feel like the same backwoods. He slid his pocket knife under the flap and unfolded a single sheet of lined paper. The message was short, barely 3 sentences. If you care about the children, you will come. Clara Belle is married to her own father, Raymond Belle. They have children together. Please, before it's too late. Harlan read it once, then again, his pulse quickening. The ink had bled slightly into the fibers of the paper, as though written in haste, or with a heavy hand. There was no signature, no details. Just an accusation so grotesque it almost didn't seem real. He walked the letter over to Sheriff Connolly, a tall man with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many years of disappointment in humanity. Connolly read it slowly, his expression never changing. When he finished, he set the paper down and rubbed his chin. "If it's true," he said at last, "it's the ugliest thing I've ever heard." Pine Ridge was the sort of place where bad news traveled faster than the wind. Yet Harlan couldn't recall hearing much about the Bells in recent years. They lived far out on the edge of town, near the old timberland that had been in their family for generations. Folks said they kept to themselves, and most people were content to let them. But there had always been a certain unease when the name came up, a flicker in the eyes, a slight lowering of the voice, as if the family's history was best left unspoken. By mid-morning, Harlan was behind the wheel of the county cruiser, the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. The road out to Bell Land started as asphalt, then crumbled into gravel, and finally gave way to mud. Potholes pooled with yesterday's rain, sending up cold sprays against the wheel wells. The forest pressed close on either side, the branches overhead tangling together like a net. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of his own tires seemed muted, swallowed by the fog and trees. Somewhere, far off, a crow called once, sharp and lonely. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, curling through the damp air like an omen. He knew the Bell property when he saw it. The house emerged from the mist suddenly, as if it had been hiding in the trees. A 2-story clapboard structure. Its once white paint had weathered to a tired gray. The porch sagged visibly, boards warped from years of neglect. On the far side of the yard, a rusted Ford pickup sat listing to one side, grass and weeds growing up through its wheels. A stack of firewood leaned precariously against the wall, and above it, smoke trailed thinly from a bent chimney pipe. Harlan slowed the cruiser and stopped well short of the drive. He didn't want to spook anyone, not yet. Stepping out, he pulled his coat tighter against the chill and walked the rest of the way on foot, boots squelching in the mud. The silence here was different, heavy, expectant, even in the stillness of the woods. There was usually some sound, the rustle of a squirrel, the flutter of a bird. Here, there was nothing. He scanned the windows as he approached, half expecting to see the edge of a curtain shift or the glint of an eye. But what struck him instead was that every single window, on both floors, was covered. Thick curtains drawn tight, the kind that let in no daylight at all. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, even in the coldest months. Folks in Pine Ridge opened their drapes to let the sun warm the room, but here, it was as though the house had been shuttered against the world. Every opening sealed. It was a detail so deliberate it made the hair on the back of his neck stir. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots leaving deep impressions in the wet ground. A child's plastic tricycle lay on its side near the porch steps, its red paint dulled and flaking. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in months. The longer he stood there, the stronger the sensation grew that this was a place where life moved differently, away from the eyes and rules of the outside world. Back at the cruiser, Harlan sat for a moment with the engine off, the fog closing in around him. He pulled out the letter again, the paper soft from where his thumb had rubbed it over and over. The words seemed heavier now, as though the house itself had confirmed them without speaking. In his gut, he knew this wouldn't be a quick visit. If the letter was true, it meant years of secrets sealed behind those curtains. And secrets like that didn't survive without someone making sure they stayed buried. Harlan started the engine, backing slowly onto the rutted road. He didn't knock on the door that day. He would return with the sheriff, with a plan, maybe even a warrant. But as the Belle house disappeared into the mist behind him, one thought settled cold in his mind. If the letter's right, God help those children. And when he came back, what he found would be worse than anything he had allowed himself to imagine. The Belle family's roots in Pine Ridge ran deep, far deeper than the black veins of coal or the stumps of the old-growth timber that once fed the town's livelihood. They arrived in the late 1800s, a handful of brothers from the highlands of Virginia who claimed a stretch of land where the Elk River twisted and narrowed. Back then, it was wilderness-dense forests, steep ridges, and a cold, fast-moving creek that cut a silver scar through the valley. They logged the tallest trees, trapped beaver and fox, and lived in cabins they built themselves. Over generations, the Belles stayed in that same place, passing it from father to son, while other families moved to the cities during the Great Depression, looking for mill jobs or factory work. The Belles dug in. They grew their own food, kept to themselves, and married mostly within the handful of families who lived close enough to share the same church pews. The world beyond the county line was considered dangerous, filled with strangers who didn't share their blood or values. By the time the 1960s rolled in, the Belle property was one of the last stretches of privately held land in the Eastern Ridge. The old sawmill in town had shut its doors, leaving behind rusted machinery and broken windows. Pine Ridge's population dwindled, storefronts emptied, and the outside world forgot about it. But the Belles didn't forget their own rules whispered from parent to child. Reinforced with scripture and fear, a Belle stands with their own. The world will try to change you. Don't let it in. Family first. Always. Raymond Belle grew up under those rules. Born in 1943, he was the youngest of 3 brothers, though by the time he turned 21, the other 2 were gone, one to Vietnam, the other to a mining accident in Fayette County. Raymond stayed, working at the mill until it closed in '67. That year, he married a local girl, Mary Thompson, who bore him one child, a daughter, Clara. Mary's death came suddenly in 1969 when Clara was only 4. Pneumonia, the doctor said. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and Raymond refused to send her until it was too late. From that moment on, Clara's life narrowed to the boundaries of the Belle property. Neighbors recalled that Raymond rarely brought her into town. If he did, she was silent, clinging to his hand, eyes fixed on the ground. By the time she should have started high school, Clara was already invisible to most of Pine Ridge. A few folks swore they saw her once, around 17, walking to the mailbox in a faded blue dress, her hair long and tangled. But sightings were rare. In the county clerk's office, buried in a stack of brittle paper records, was a marriage license dated August 14, 1979. The names were written neatly in black ink: Raymond E. Belle, age 36, and Clara M. Belle, age 21. The handwriting was the same for both signatures. Harlan would later find that curious, especially because school enrollment documents from the late 1970s suggested Clara was no older than 16 at the time. By the early 1980s, rumors began to drift into town like smoke. Clara was pregnant, that much seemed certain. But who the father was, no one could say. Some assumed it was an outsider who'd passed through and left. Others muttered darker suspicions but swallowed them down, unwilling to accuse without proof. One neighbor, an older woman named Ruth Miller, told Harlan later, "When I saw her belly big with that first baby, I thought, that can't be right. She was still a child herself, and I never once saw another man go up to that house." Ruth claimed she once brought over a pie in the summer of '82, hoping to visit the new baby. She knocked twice on the door, hearing faint movement inside, but no one answered. She left the pie on the porch, and when she returned the next day, it was gone. The plate sat clean on the steps, as though it had never been used. By then, Raymond's property had become something of a ghost zone in Pine Ridge. Kids dared each other to walk past it at night, and grown men avoided it unless they had to hunt nearby. Whatever was happening behind those drawn curtains, the rest of the town seemed content or afraid to leave it alone. That is, until the letter arrived on Harlan's desk, and when he followed that dirt road to the Bell house. The memories of these whispered stories took on a new weight. The marriage certificate, the isolation, the closed curtains, they weren't random details anymore. They were pieces of a puzzle he was starting to see, the kind of puzzle that, once solved, could not be unseen. Sheriff Connolly was careful not to stir the water too soon. In a town like Pine Ridge, one wrong word could kill an investigation before it began. For the first 2 weeks after the letter arrived, the sheriff's office operated quietly, asking questions in neighboring counties under the guise of routine record checks. The first lead came from the old postmaster, George Hensley, who'd handled Bell family mail for decades. Clara had come in once a month, maybe less. Hensley told Harlan over a cup of coffee in the back of the post office. Never spoke unless I asked her something directly, but I'll tell you this, she always took mail, addressed to Mrs. Raymond Belle. Every time. I figured maybe he'd remarried. Guess I was wrong about that. The next piece of the puzzle came from Summers County Hospital, 40 miles away. A nurse, speaking off the record, confirmed that Clara had delivered 2 children there, one in 1981, the other in 1983. In both cases, the father listed on the birth certificate was Raymond Belle. The attending physician had raised an eyebrow at the unusual age gap between the parents, but the paperwork had been in order, and no complaint had been made. That was before we had mandatory reporting laws for certain age discrepancies, the nurse said with a tight voice. These days, we'd have to call it in. But it wasn't just the medical records. In late November, a trash hauler from town found a box dumped at the old landfill. Most of it was broken household items, cracked dishes, moldy clothes, but at the bottom was a water-damaged notebook, its pages swollen from rain. He tossed it into the cab of his truck, thinking it might make decent kindling, before burning it. Curiosity made him flip through the first few pages. The handwriting was slanted, delicate, almost childlike. One entry stood out. "Daddy says the world will never understand us. He says our love is ours alone, and no one can take it from us. When I ask about God, he says God made us this way, so it must be right. The hauler turned it over to the sheriff's office. Though no name was written inside, Harlan had no doubt whose voice he was reading. The language matched the isolation he'd heard described a world where Raymond's word was the only truth. By early December, Harlan and Connolly decided to put eyes on the property. They hiked in along a ridge trail that skirted the back of the Belle land, bringing a camera with a long lens. From that vantage point, they could see the rear of the house and a patch of yard where a rusting swing set stood. The first day, nothing. The second day, just smoke from the chimney. But on the third afternoon, Clara emerged from the back door. She was carrying a basket of laundry, her hair pulled into a loose braid. 2 children trailed after her, a boy, maybe 3 years old, and a girl no older than a toddler, even at a distance. The resemblance between the boy and Raymond was striking. The set of the jaw, the curve of the nose, unmistakable. Harlan lifted the camera and snapped 3 quick frames. The photos were shown discreetly to Dr. Kent, the county physician, who confirmed what Harlan already feared. The resemblance is too strong to ignore, Kent said, his eyes scanning the images. If you want more than speculation, you'll need blood tests. Getting those tests meant a delicate approach. In January, under the pretense of a community health survey, a nurse from the county clinic visited the Belle home. She managed to collect hair and toothbrush samples from the children, claiming it was for a nutritional study. The items were rushed to a private lab 3 counties over. Weeks later, the results came back. The DNA report was printed on plain white paper. But to Harlan, it may as well have been written in red ink. Probability of paternity Raymond Belle as biological father of both children 99.98%. Probability of paternity Raymond Belle as biological father of the children's mother 99.99%. It was proof, not suspicion. Not rumor proof that Raymond Belle was both the father of Clara and the father of her children. Harlan sat at his desk with the report in hand, the late afternoon sun spilling across the paper. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows. There would be no going back from this. The question now wasn't whether the Belle's secret was real. It was how many years or decades it had been building behind those curtains, and what it would take to tear it open without shattering the lives inside. On the morning of February 19th, 1985, a convoy of 2 sheriff's cruisers and 1 unmarked sedan rolled down the narrow dirt track toward the Belle property. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the frosted ground. Breath plumed from the men as they stepped out, boots crunching on the thin crust of ice. Sheriff Connolly took the lead, his expression fixed, the arrest warrant folded in his coat pocket. Raymond Belle was already standing on the porch when they arrived, as if he had been expecting them. His tall frame filled the doorway, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His eyes, pale and sharp, flicked from one man to the next before settling on Connolly. "You got something to say to me?" Sheriff Raymond asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Connolly didn't answer right away. He simply held out the folded paper. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Charges include incest, statutory rape, and child abuse." Raymond's lips tightened into the faintest smirk. "You people don't understand a damn thing. You never have." From inside the house came the faint sound of a child's voice, followed by the creak of a floorboard. Clara appeared in the dim hallway, her face pale, eyes wide. She was barefoot, wearing a faded nightgown, her hair loose and tangled. When her gaze met Harlan's, it was almost pleading, but for what? He couldn't tell. "Ma'am," Connolly said gently, "we're here to help." Raymond stepped down from the porch, but not before tossing his cigarette into the snow. The deputies moved in, cuffing him with practiced precision. He didn't resist, only muttered under his breath, "The blood stays pure." that's how it's meant to be. Inside, the house was dim and airless, smelling of stale smoke and damp wood. Every curtain was still drawn tight, shutting out what little daylight there was. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing darkened plaster beneath. The living room held only a sagging couch, a coffee table cluttered with ashtrays, and a kerosene heater humming faintly in the corner. Clara stood motionless, her hands clasped at her waist. When Connolly told her she and the children would be taken somewhere safe, she nodded, but her expression carried a strange mix of relief and terror. In the days that followed, Clara's interviews with investigators painted a chilling picture. She spoke in a flat, almost rehearsed tone, as if repeating lessons learned long ago. "Daddy told me the world was poison," she said in one recorded statement. "The people out there would try to tear us apart if they knew what we had. He said we were chosen to keep the bloodline pure, that it was our duty." When asked if she understood that he was her father, Clara blinked slowly before answering. Of course. That's why it mattered. Anyone else would have been wrong. The belief wasn't born with Raymond alone. Digging through family records, Harlan discovered notes from the 1930s, an old, leather-bound ledger belonging to Raymond's grandfather. One passage, written in a spidery hand, read, "Our people have lasted because we keep to our own. Outsiders bring sickness, both in the body and in the mind. Better to marry kin than to mix with the corrupt." But in Raymond's hands, that superstition had hardened into law. Clara had grown up hearing it as gospel, never knowing another way to see the world. By the time she was old enough to question it, the lines between father, husband, and jailer were already blurred beyond recognition. When the DNA results were presented to Raymond during interrogation, he didn't deny them. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded, and said, "That just proves I was right. The children are mine twice over. They'll be stronger for it." The words chilled even the most seasoned officers in the room. By March, the story had leaked to the local press, and then to state newspapers. The community reaction was split. Some called for Raymond's immediate execution. Others insisted it was all a smear by outsiders who never understood mountain ways. But for most, the details were too grotesque to excuse. For Harlan, the image that stayed burned in his mind was that first day on the ridge, watching Clara step into the yard with her children. The little boy had been holding her hand. Now he understood that the hand holding his was also the same blood as his grandfather. The curtain had finally been pulled back, and what lay behind it was something no one could unsee. And yet, the hardest part still lay ahead, dismantling a lifetime of lies without destroying what little remained of the lives inside. The trial of State v. Raymond E. Belle opened on a humid morning in late June 1985 at the Fayette County Courthouse, a red brick building whose old clock tower presided over the square like an unspeaking witness. The case had drawn attention far beyond West Virginia's hills. Reporters from Charleston, Pittsburgh, and even national outlets from New York crowded the press benches. The gallery was full every day, locals who wanted justice, strangers curious about the scandal, and a few who came simply to stare at the man at the center of it all. Raymond Belle sat at the defense table in a crisp shirt and tie, his long hair combed flat. He didn't fidget, didn't look at the reporters, didn't even glance toward Clara. His pale eyes stayed fixed on a point just above the judge's head, as though the whole proceeding were an irritation he planned to outlast. The air inside the courtroom was thick, the ceiling fans doing little more than push the heat around. On the third day, Clara took the stand. 22 years old, she looked younger, her hair pinned back with a plain clip. She spoke softly at first, answering questions with a minimal yes or no, but as the hours went on, her voice began to steady, each word landing heavier than the last. She told the jury about a childhood with no school and no friends, where the only voice of authority belonged to her father. She recalled her mother's sudden death when she was 4, the way Raymond moved into her room, explaining it was to keep her safe. She described how he wrapped their life in layers of fear warnings that the world outside their land was poison, that strangers would hurt her, and that their bond was special and holy, blessed by God himself. "I didn't think it was wrong," she said, her eyes fixed on her hands in her lap. "I thought, that's just what family did when they loved each other enough." The prosecution laid out the evidence with clinical precision. The marriage certificate from 1979, the hospital records listing Raymond as both father and husband, the DNA results showing a 99.99% probability that he was the father of both Clara and her children. They read passages from the water damage journal recovered from the landfill, Clara's own words, recorded years before Daddy says the world will never understand us. Our love is ours alone. When photographs of the children were entered into evidence, a quiet ripple went through the courtroom. The resemblance between Raymond and the little boy was undeniable. The same sharp jawline and pale eyes. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, their faces tight. The defense tried to paint the relationship as consensual, pointing to the marriage certificate and Clara's legal age listed at the time. But the forged date of birth was impossible to defend, and the testimony of witnesses' neighbors, hospital staff. The postmaster drew a picture of a girl groomed from childhood, denied any chance at an independent thought. After 9 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts incest, statutory rape, and 2 counts of child abuse. When the judge pronounced the sentence life in prison without the possibility of parole, Raymond's only reaction was a slight nod, as if confirming something he'd already accepted. He was led out of the courtroom without a glance toward Clara. Clara's fate was different, but no less complicated. She was placed in the care of a state psychiatric program, where doctors tried to untangle years of conditioning. At first, she resisted therapy, referring to Raymond as her husband and insisting their relationship had been God's plan. Over months, the language began to change. She started calling him my father, though she often hesitated afterward, as if testing the word's weight. Counselors noted that she struggled with guilt, part victim, part unwilling accomplice in her own mind. The children, just 3 and 1 at the time of the arrest, were placed in foster care. The state sealed their records, granting them new identities to protect them from the shadow of their past. Whether they would one day learn the truth was a question no one could answer. The Belle case didn't fade quietly. In 1986, West Virginia legislators passed laws tightening marriage verification requirements, closing the loopholes that had allowed underage marriages with falsified documents or coerced consent. Mandatory welfare checks were instituted for children in isolated homes, and rural health workers received training to spot the signs of coercive control and abuse. Still, the name Belle lingered like smoke in Pine Ridge. The property sat empty, its clapboard siding peeling away, the roof sagging inward. Eventually, the house collapsed under a heavy snow one winter, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a gravestone. Hunters avoided the area, claiming it felt wrong that even the air seemed heavier there. For Deputy Harlan, the case left a mark he couldn't shake. In quiet moments, he'd think back to that foggy November morning, the first time he saw the Belle house with every curtain drawn. It struck him how close the truth had come to staying hidden forever. If not for a single anonymous letter, the cycle might have continued for another generation. Sometimes, late at night, he would unfold the copy of that letter he'd kept in his desk. If you care about the children, you will come. It was a simple plea written in a trembling hand, and it had changed everything. Years later, he would still find himself wondering about the person who wrote it. Were they a neighbor who finally couldn't stay silent, a family member who'd escaped, or someone who had simply seen too much and carried the burden until it broke them. And more than anything, he wondered if it had been your neighbor, your town, your road, would you have had the courage to come,